Yesterday was Easter Sunday, and I hope you had a wonderful Easter. I certainly did. We just did kind of a quiet Easter at home. In fact, we watched a wonderful Easter service. The pastor Alistair Begg, who is out of Cleveland, is just a marvelous and gifted Bible teacher. And if you haven't encountered him, you should check out his sermons. And his Easter sermon of yesterday was just fabulous. But as often happens, he'll say something, and sometimes it could just be a line or two that gets me thinking. We were talking about, of course, the meaning of Easter. And the meaning of Easter is that as Christ rises, the resurrection comes after Christ's perfect sacrifice. So what was Christ's perfect sacrifice? Well, it was his substitutionary atonement for our sins. Let's remember that in the Old Testament, people would use what we now kind of call, in a slightly different context, a scapegoat. And what I mean is that people would sacrifice an animal, a goat or a ram, to God. And the idea wasn't just that we're making a propitiation, where we're giving something that we tend to as shepherds, we're offering something valuable to us to God. The idea was that the scapegoat, the offering, would take on our sins. So symbolically, we've wronged God and we've wronged our fellow man, but we're not able to fully atone for that. So what do? It's almost like we symbolically take our offenses and we put them into this animal, and the animal is then sacrificed to God as a kind of substitute for human failings. Well, it turns out that in the New Testament, we discover the true meaning of all this. Christ is, in fact, the Lamb who provides the substitutionary atonement. But as I was thinking about all this, I was actually also thinking about another common theory that explains Christ's sacrifice, and it is the so-called ransom theory. A number of times in the Bible, it is said that Jesus gave himself up, sacrificed himself as a ransom for human sin. And I was reminded of an argument that is made by the medieval theologian Peter Abelard against this ransom theory. Peter Abelard was kind of a little bit of an iconoclast, a little bit of a flamboyant theologian, but also extremely penetrating and interesting. And he embraces the theory of substitutionary atonement, but rejects the ransom theory. He says that you cannot take that term ransom in a literal sense. And he explains why, and I want to go into it because I think it's really interesting. So let's think about what happens in a ransom. Let's say you have a kidnapper, and the kidnapper kidnaps, let's say, Debbie's daughter. And the kidnapper says, you and Debbie have to pay $1 million or $100,000 in order to get her back. So now let's look at all the main parties here. You've got the bad guy, which is the kidnapper or kidnappers. You've got the victim that has been seized, and that is Debbie's daughter. You've got the money that is due, the ransom itself. That's the $100,000. And then you've got the party or parties that are going to have to pay that, and that's Debbie and me. And Peter Abelard, in using this framework, now says, now let's apply the ransom theory to God. God is supposedly the one who's paying the ransom. So God is in the position of me and Debbie. What is the ransom? Jesus. So Jesus is in the position of the $100,000. Jesus is actually what is being given up. But what has been taken? Who has been taken ransom? Mankind. So mankind is in the position of Debbie's daughter. Mankind is being held captive, but captive by whom? Who's the kidnapper? Who's the bad guy? Well, Peter Abelard said that has to be Satan. Satan is the bad guy. Supposedly Satan is holding mankind captive, and therefore God has to pay the ransom. But then, says Peter Abelard, this doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't make any sense because it implies that God is indebted to Satan. God sort of owes Satan, or God needs to pay Satan up because Satan is somehow legitimately holding mankind. Satan has a right to hold mankind, and therefore God is either reluctantly, because God has no other way to get mankind back, or God, in order to satisfy the requirements of justice, has to pay Satan. But Peter Abelard says Satan is a cheat. He's a deceiver. He has wickedly seduced mankind over to his side. So even if Satan is holding man in captivity, God doesn't owe Satan anything. God doesn't have to pay up. That doesn't really make any sense. I think what makes more sense is to think of the ransom theory sort of this way, that the reason that Jesus is given up as a sacrifice by God is not that God owes Satan, but that one attribute or one side of God owes something to another side of God. What does this really mean? God is all just. And God is also all loving or all merciful. So the justice side of God cannot admit man back into heaven without paying some atonement for sin. So God's requirement of justice requires some satisfaction. And so the sacrifice of Jesus is a way ultimately of reconciling divine justice with divine mercy or love. And I think that's a better way to think about it than the simple idea, directly applied or non-metaphorically applied, of God somehow paying a ransom to Satan.